"Try to shoot a young one," I said. "They're the best eating." Thus I advised my hunting partner, Joe Elliott, as we stood watching the sun creep over the horizon and paint the eastern Montana prairie in shades of gold. We'd driven from our homes in western Montana last September to hunt North America's largest grouse. After spending the night camped near the small town of Malta, we got an early start and drove south toward a public tract where we'd found sage grouse in previous years. This is cowboy country, just north of the Missouri River and the sprawling C.M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge. There are still plenty of cowboys and sage grouse in Montana, but times are changing. The open range is largely a thing of the past, and these days some ranchers round up their cattle with four-wheelers and motorbikes. Sage grouse, too, have been losing a gradual war of attrition across the West. The big birds need sagebrush, and sagebrush has too often been poisoned, burned, and plowed to make room for grassland, farms, and condos. While Joe and his dog Gret made a swing toward an old corral off in the distance, I walked through knee-high sagebrush toward a small reservoir a half-mile away. Along the way, my Brittany, Ollie, disappeared over a rise, and when his bell grew silent, I hurried to the brow of the hill. As I approached the point where I'd last heard the bell, a large brown bird rose from the sage, too far for a shot. Then another, closer bird cleared the sage and peeled away. I swung my 12-gauge over-under ahead of his beak, pulled the trigger, and watched him fold. Ollie soon had the big male grouse in tow, so much for shooting a small, tender one. Ollie managed to haul him most of the way to me before spitting him out. Considering the warm morning, the loose feathers in his mouth, and the size of the bird, I didn't blame him. I would have spit him out too. I'd shot the Sasquatch of the grouse world, a mature male sage grouse weighing upwards of 5 pounds. Sage grouse often receive bad press when it comes to edibility, but they make excellent table fare early in the year when their diet consists of green plants and insects. Young birds are tender and good, especially when cut into pieces, marinated and grilled over coals. Big bombers like the one I shot are best tenderized in a slow cooker and used to make stew. Later in the fall, when the birds shift to a sagebrush diet, they're called sage grouse for a reason, the meat gets darker and stronger. Sage grouse need to be field-dressed promptly and iced down as soon as possible. A bird that spends hours stewing in its own juices in the back of your game vest on a warm day won't win any culinary prizes. While there's no question the sage hen is our largest grouse, hunters and outdoor writers tend to exaggerate. Sage grouse the size of turkeys don't exist. Biologist Robert Patterson, who wrote The Sage Grouse in Wyoming, weighed hundreds of them in the course of his research. He found that mature males weigh 5 to 7 pounds in winter and spring, but less during hunting season. A 5-pound sage grouse in September, when most are taken by hunters, is a big one. Females average 3 pounds or so in winter, but weigh less than 3 pounds in early fall. In a Montana study of breeding grouse, one Boone and Crockett male tipped the scales at nearly 9 pounds. Like the bison they once coexisted with on the western plains, sage grouse need wide-open spaces to survive. When human presence increases, the birds decline. The latest threat is energy development, especially coal bed methane. When noise from generators, truck traffic, and compressors reverberates across the prairie, grouse are driven from ancestral strutting grounds. Adding to their woes, sage grouse are vulnerable to the recently introduced West Nile virus, a mosquito-borne illness that affects horses and wild birds as well as humans. While sage grouse continue to have strongholds in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, Nevada, and Oregon, they have declined or even disappeared in many parts of the West. Between 1965 and 1985, sage grouse numbers dropped an estimated 50% throughout the region. The Gunnison sage grouse, now considered a separate species, has lost 90% of its habitat and clings to survival only in limited portions of Colorado and Utah. For the past decade, the greater sage grouse has narrowly averted being listed on the federal endangered species list. In 2004, after petitioning by environmental groups, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, USFWS, concluded the species does not currently warrant federal protection. But in 2010, the USFWS revisited the status of the sage grouse, noting that listing is warranted but precluded at present by other species facing more pressing threats. This reprieve has served as a catalyst for action, says Mark Sullivan, the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks (FWP) wildlife manager for northeastern Montana. As a result of potential listing, sage grouse have been studied intensively in Montana and other parts of the West, he says. We're learning a lot more about their habitat needs and how disturbances like energy development affect them. I'm optimistic we'll be able to do a better job of mitigating impacts and managing their populations in the future. Although there are ongoing problems with loss of sagebrush habitat in Montana, the state's sage grouse populations are largely intact. FWP has developed a management plan that identifies current threats and lays out strategies for keeping sagebrush habitats healthy. Through a Montana Sagebrush initiative, FWP has enrolled thousands of acres in a leasing program in which landowners agree not to spray, burn, or plow sagebrush habitat for a 30-year period. Sullivan notes that FWP has refined its sage grouse survey techniques in recent years. We've increased the number of leks, strutting grounds, we monitor each spring and have developed more standardized procedures. FWP has been aided in its inventory efforts by the Adopt a Lek program, launched in 1999 by the National Wildlife Federation. Volunteers, largely sage grouse hunters, count sage grouse at dawn each April on their breeding leks, providing needed data on population trends. At the federal level, the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, launched a sage grouse initiative in 2010 designed to conserve habitat through public-private partnerships. Since then, NRCS has obligated $112 million in financial assistance to conserve sage grouse in 11 western states. Pheasants Forever, a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving pheasants, quail, and other wildlife, has been selected to manage the majority of the funds and coordinate the activities of public and private partners. The NRCS initiative calls for establishing sustainable grazing systems to improve hiding cover, marking or moving high-risk fences near breeding sites to reduce bird collisions, and removing invasive conifers to allow recolonization of otherwise suitable sage grouse habitat. Sullivan points out that sage grouse conservation can't succeed on a broad scale without the cooperation of state and federal agencies, private landowners, and hunters. Listing the sage grouse as endangered poses a huge concern for landowners, he says. It could limit where and how they graze cattle, and that directly affects their lives and livelihood. Most ranchers work hard to conserve the landscape, asserts Leo Barthelmess Jr., a third-generation rancher who lives southeast of Malta. Winner of a 2010 Montana Neighbor Award for Land Stewardship, Barthelmess has worked with range scientists and biologists from Montana State University through the Undaunted Stewardship Program to improve sage grouse habitat on his family property. We have one sage grouse lek on our property, and there are more on neighboring properties, he says. We try to operate our ranch in a holistic manner and find value in everything here, including sage grouse. He notes that his cow-calf and sheep ranch now sees more wildlife since he began a rotational grazing system. We're continuing to build fences and subdivide our pastures to refine the system, he says. We've established range monitoring plots that help us document changes due to weather and grazing, and better evaluate the effects of our system on livestock and wildlife. Rotational grazing helps build topsoil, retard erosion, and improve nesting habitat for a variety of birds, including sage grouse. Barthelmess is a founding member of the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance, which works with a host of agencies and private organizations to conserve sage grouse habitat in eastern Montana. With more resources devoted to sagebrush conservation and recovery, hopefully we can keep the sage grouse off the endangered species list, he says. Suddenly, it seems as if everyone is pulling for the sage grouse. With cattlemen, biologists, conservationists, politicians, and hunters all working to preserve this western icon, the chances of stemming the population decline seem promising. One can't wonder if this cooperative blitzkrieg to save the sage grouse, if it succeeds, will serve as a new model for wildlife conservation efforts. How do hunters fit into the picture? Hunters have a lot at stake, says FWP's Sullivan. If the sage grouse lands on the endangered species list, it's unclear what will happen in states like Montana that have healthy, huntable populations. I talk with some hunters who have given up sage grouse hunting. thinking they are doing their part to conserve the species. But that's a self-defeating proposition, because without funding and political support from hunters, sage-grouse habitat is less likely to be preserved. Studies with banded birds in huntable populations have shown that only a small percentage of sage-grouse mortality is due to hunting. These days, few hunters pursue sage-grouse with the idea of filling the freezer, nor does the law allow it. In recent years, the bag limit in Montana has been cut to 2 birds, 4 in possession, and the once-long season has been shortened to 2 months. But part of the beauty of a sage-grouse hunt is the possibility of bagging more than sage-grouse. Sharp-tailed grouse and Hungarian partridge often occupy areas where grassland and sagebrush intersect. Sage-grouse don't have the explosive takeoff of other game birds, but once they're airborne, they fly just as fast. The females rock from side to side in flight, a trait not shared by the larger males. One researcher recorded the average speed of males in sustained flight at close to 50 miles per hour. They are capable of flying for miles, and large flocks sometimes migrate from winter to summer range at altitudes of 200 to 500 feet. The tendency to migrate, says Sullivan, complicates habitat recovery, since migrating birds need summer range, winter range, and stopover points between. Without a doubt, early autumn is the best time to hunt sage-grouse on the western prairie. You can throw a sleeping bag on the ground with the smell of sagebrush heavy on the air, look up at the night sky to watch shooting stars flicker and die, and fall asleep to a coyote lullaby. In the morning, you might find frost on your sleeping bag. You wrap your hands around a steaming cup of coffee and look out at the prairie as far as you can see, and wonder how you'll ever find a grouse in the olive-grey sea of sagebrush. With good luck and boot leather, you'll find them, but you might walk farther than you had planned, lured on by the prospect of a sage-grouse bonanza just over the next rise. Republished with permission from Hunting the Sagebrush Sasquatch by Dave Books, 2012. The Upland Almanac, Spring 2012, 2012 by Dave Books.